If you want to catch more fish, a skill you have to master is presenting your flies in as natural a way as possible. If your flies don't look and act like the real thing, the fish, they ain't gonna eat them. And here's the deal. There's way more to presentation than just a drag-free drift. There's a whole bunch of other skills and techniques that you can employ to make your flies as tempting as possible. We spend a ton of time trying to figure out what the fish are eating and choosing the right fly out of our box. But I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. Presentation, it's even more important than the fly that you tie on. Here at VFC, we talk about presentation all the time and how it relates to putting more fish in the net. But what does that even mean? What makes up good presentation? Getting good presentation means that you've gotten a fish to think that your fake flies are the real thing. And today, we're gonna go over the 2 keys to perfect presentation. And the first key is getting our flies into the strike zone. Simply put, we'll define the strike zone as where the fish are feeding in the water column. To solidify this, let's talk about 2 polar opposite situations. On the left, we've got a wonderful fishing hole full of hungry trout. It's springtime and there's a hatch going on. So you've got nymphs swimming from the bottom of the river, making their way to the surface and turning into adults on the surface. This is what we dream about as fly anglers. These fish, they're keyed in on emerging bugs and adults. So they're hanging out in the top of the water column, chowing away. On the right, we've got the same hole, but now it's winter time. The fish are trying to conserve energy and bug activity, it's basically non-existent. They're gonna huddle up in the deepest, slowest section of this hole, right up against the bottom. Chances are the only way that you're gonna catch these fish is if your flies hit them right in the nose. You can clearly see that we've got 2 different strike zones going on. And so if we want to perfect our presentation, we need to make sure that our flies are riding through the strike zone, whether it be on top, like in that first situation, or down near the bottom, like in that second. And that can change season to season, or week to week, or sometimes even day to day. In a minute, I'm going to share some tips on how to make sure your flies are getting into the strike zone. But before we do that, let's go over our second key to perfect presentation, eliminating drag. Simply put, drag is just unnatural movement of your fly, and it's a dead giveaway to fish that it's fake. But lucky for us, it's pretty easy to spot. Imagine a leaf falling onto the river. What happens? It doesn't really have a mind of its own, right? It kind of just drifts and moves according to the water speed and current. So when a real life bug is in the water, regardless of if it's an adult riding on the surface or a nymph drifting through the current, it behaves just like that leaf. It goes with the flow. And we want our flies to do the exact same thing. Here I'm gonna show you 2 different flies, and I want you to pay attention to what is different. Yeah, you see that little wake? That fly looks like it's riding a jet ski. That's drag. We don't want that. It's like a neon sign saying, "Don't eat me, I'm fake." There are very few things that turn a fish off to your fly like a bad drift. You could have the perfect fly, drifting right through the strike zone. But if it's dragging, that fish will turn up its nose like a kid at a plate of broccoli. Now that we understand the 2 keys to perfect presentation, I've got 3 tips that are gonna help you get your flies into the strike zone and eliminate drag. And tip number 1 is all about choosing the right rig. When I first started fly fishing, I had no idea how much choosing the right rig and setting it up correctly can impact your presentation and ultimately lead to catching more fish. Let's talk big picture for a second. There are a bunch of rigs in our angling tool belt. We've got dry fly rigs, dry dropper rigs, nymph rigs, and even streamer rigs. And if you want to learn about the most reliable, time-tested rigs that we use here at VFC, we put together a Rigs and Knots Pocket Guide. It teaches you exactly how to set them up step by step. I'll throw a link in the description if you're interested. But long story short, we've got a ton of rigs to choose from. So let's run through a couple of scenarios together and decide which one we're going to use. Scenario 1. You can see bugs flying around in the air and on the water's surface. You look upstream and you notice a bunch of fish rising. Scenario 2. You pull up to the river and take a moment to watch and wait. You don't see any bugs. You don't see any fish rising. It's a ghost town. Scenario 3. Same thing. You pull up to the river, you take a moment to watch and wait. You don't see any fish rising, but it is late summer and you see some grasshoppers crawling on the bushes and flying around. So let's connect our rigs with each scenario. In scenario 1, the strike zone is going to be that upper third of the water column. Those fish are hanging out right near the surface, munching on adults and emergers. A dry or double dry fly rig is going to be perfect. Scenario 2. It's actually pretty common because something like 90% of a fish's diet comes from subsurface food sources. So this is where getting our flies down near the bottom would be the best bet. To do that, we'll go with our double nymph rig, my preferred method, or you could do a streamer rig as well. And then scenario 3, it's very similar to scenario 2. Not much is happening, but sometimes those grasshoppers fall into the water and become fish food. So this would be a good chance to try out our dry dropper rig. You fish that hopper on top of the water and a fish might come up and eat that. Or if they want to stick to the bottom and eat your nymph, you give them that option as well. What makes the dry dropper rig so effective is that you're putting your flies into 2 different strike zones. Now that was big picture, right? But there are some small picture changes we can make to our rigs to help improve presentation. When it comes to dry fly rigs, something that you'll need to watch out for is micro drag. This is that drag that we talked about earlier, but it's so small that you can't see it from where you're fishing, but the fish can. A good way to combat micro drag is by sizing down your tippet. So if you have a fish come up and look at your dry fly and then refuse it, you either want to size down your fly, size down your tippet, or if you're dealing with really picky fish, both. And when it comes to dialing in your dry dropper or double nymph rig, I like to use our trial and error framework. If you're catching fish, you're in the strike zone, no adjustments needed. If you never catch bottom, you need to either adjust your indicator length, tie on heavier flies, or add split shot in that order. If you're catching bottom every time, just do the opposite. And if you catch bottom every 4 to 5 casts or right at the end of your drift, you're most likely in the strike zone and it's only a matter of time before a fish bites. Now that we've chosen the right rig and are in the strike zone, let's move on to tip number 2, which is all about positioning. Fish are pretty observant critters. If they know we're there or if we spook them, they might not eat our flies even if they're presented perfectly. So before we even start fishing or throw our first cast, we need to position ourselves in a way that doesn't warn these fish that we're there and we're ready to catch them. And there are 3 things that I like to do that reduce my chances of spooking fish. Number 1, I stay low and behind them. Fish have fantastic eyesight and are facing upstream 99% of the time. Not only do they need to see very small bugs cruising by at 80 miles an hour, but they need to watch out for overhead predators. They are very wary of anything moving above the water or in front of them. But all that we can use to our advantage. When approaching fish, you reduce your chance of spooking them by staying low and approaching from behind. So don't be afraid to crouch and move slowly if you need to. The second thing I do is make my first cast count. The more that you cast at a fish, the more likely it is that that fish either spooks or knows you're there. Fish are much more willing to eat your fly on the first cast through a hole than any other cast after that. And then the third thing I do is work close to far. A very easy way to spook fish is by having fly line land near or on top of them. It makes quite a big disturbance when it hits the water, so when fishing, cast the fish or spots that are closest to you first, then work your way out to other spots. Positioning is all about finding the balance between getting close enough that you can throw a good cast and not getting too close that you spook the fish. Which leads us right into tip number 3, which is all about mending. Simply put, mending is a technique that reduces drag. Here we've got 2 different currents, one fast and one slow. I want my flies to drift in the slower water, but my fly line lands in the faster water when I cast. If I do absolutely nothing, that fly line will move downstream faster than my fly, causing it to drag. The solution is to mend my fly line. I'll simply lift my fly line and move it upstream so that it's even and moving at the same speed as my fly. And I'm gonna do this as many times as I can, maintaining that drag-free drift on my fly. Again, mending is just lifting your fly line and moving it. A lot of beginners or people that struggle with mending think of it as flicking the fly line or almost even another cast. Because of the water's surface tension, that fly line is almost suction cupped to the top of the water. And so if you just flick your fly line, it's probably not gonna do much, or it's gonna move your fly. So make sure you lift a few feet of fly line off the water, move it upstream, and try to do it in one fluid motion. Just like anything else in fly fishing, mending is a skill you can improve. This episode of our fly selection masterclass may have seemed like a side quest, and it kind of was. But that's only because choosing the right fly out of your box does not matter if you don't have good presentation. Up next, we'll talk all about how the seasons and weather can impact your success. Understanding these concepts can be the difference between getting skunked and catching fish. Check it out right here.